Hi, listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everyone left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with bereavement professionals. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Janet Cristofero, and produced by the Dougy Center for Grieving Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Today we're joined by Suzanne Anderson. Suzanne is the co-author of the book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead. Her work as a writer, speaker, and leadership innovator is dedicated to awakening women to their full potential and urging them to the edge of their own evolution. Hi, Suzanne. Thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you, Jana, for inviting me.
Suzanne, back in 2012, you were just finishing up the first draft of your book. And I'm imagining that was a time of excitement, but also mixed with some trepidation. And then in that crossroads moment, your husband died of suicide. And you write about how that experience really tossed you into what you've described as a very dark and difficult abyss. And I'm wondering, looking back at that time now from this place, which we're almost 5 years later, what really stands out to you?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think when probably any of us who have been through tremendous loss that's especially shocking, I can't even relate to it as being 5 years, first of all. Everything happens so incredibly quickly, and also it seems to take forever. So I would say my experience of time is fundamentally changed. When I would say initially after the suicide and all the things that came, in the wake of that, there was only really the capacity to attend to what had to be attended to, because in my situation, it was not just the loss of my beloved partner, husband, but also within a very short period of time, needing to sell our estate, to leave the community I was a part of, move from this small island we lived on. There was enormous change at every single level. And I only could really focus on now. And it just took me till about a year ago to be able to look back, to actually be in the seat of the question you were just asking me. And I started working on my second book, which is about how I have gone through these last few years and how to go through these kinds of dark times as a rite of passage and a transformative fire. So what really stands out, I guess, is somehow that I'm still standing, and that my life is so dramatically different from what it was 5 years ago. And there was so much uncertainty at many points along the way about what would happen, where would I be, how would things unfold. And so I will say I'm probably humbled, grateful, and still very curious about this new life that's opening up in front of me.
You said something really interesting in how in the moment, well, I should say, after your husband died, it really threw you into having to be completely in the moment. What happens next? What happens next? And that it was only years later that you're able to sit in a place of reflecting on what that time was like for yourself.
Yeah, I think, one thing, as you mentioned, I was just completing the book and was ready to send it into the world, find a publisher when David took his life. And the work that I had been doing and the research for over 15 years was really around how to help women really awaken the next level, I would say, of our wholeness, that brings together all of our feminine and all of our masculine ways of being. This is something I knew something about, how to go through difficult circumstances, how to be in challenging moments and actually show up from this place of grounded presence, and a place that is more what you were just saying, in the present moment, more now. I certainly knew this in theory because I'd been doing a lot of research, worked with hundreds of women in my programs. And I knew it in experience as well, but the enormous, the brutality maybe of what happened, and when there's traumatic loss, is that I really had to use everything that I knew and everything that I had generated over many years of my own meditation practice and teaching and the things I knew, to be able to be with what was actually happening. And there is the actual neuroscience of trauma, which has the neocortex kind of go offline anyway. I mean, you don't have a lot of ability when you go through this kind of a loss to think much about the future. And there was no advantage for me to be nostalgic about the past, because there was just so much to actually do in the moment. So I would say that's probably one of the deepest experiences and learnings I have, and has something to do with my relationship to time now, was to really experience what it is to come all the way in the body to the present moment and be with what is directly in front of you.
It almost seems like you're talking about the idea of being fully embodied in and with your grief.
100%. Especially for somebody like me, let's say, who I have had a very long time spiritual path for many decades. And in some ways, it could have been easy to go what I call up and out, and I was grateful for many of the perspectives I had and that come from my own spiritual path. But actually, I think part of why I am standing now, and my book did get published and I'm in the world with my work in the way that I am right now, is because I was able to come down and was able to actually be in my body and with my body, with my heart, with my feelings. But we aren't taught this when we're children growing up, or, we want to get away from our grief or our fear or our anger,
From anything that feels uncomfortable or unusual.
Exactly, from the discomfort of those feelings, and as though they're not supposed to be there. So to really, and I experience waves of grief. I would say grief is more a wave than a particle. It moves on its own terms. And when it moves, and when it swells up and would swell up through my heart and body, I almost could say I let it take me. I learned to let it take me. I learned to honor it as part of the healing process that, and it would come, as I'm sure, especially after the first couple of months, in strange ways, something would trigger it in a way that you wouldn't imagine. And then the ability to have the capacity to be with it. So this, for me, those strategies were knowing how to ground myself, how to breathe, how to not run from it, but actually kind of move toward it, as I say, again, as a healing, not as a indulgence. And then to have the limbic support of friends and allies to be with, to hold me while I was letting that wave move through me.
As you're talking about that, it seems such an important distinction that we can hear, like, let the grief wave take you, make sure you immerse yourself and not numb out from it. But to do that without also having a skill set with you and some tools as you maybe go into that grief wave. It's how important it is to have that with it, whether it's support people or, as you mentioned, for you, grounding practices and breathing. And I think sometimes that's what can get missed in the general sense about grief of, don't avoid it, but we also need to teach you some skills to take
Absolutely.
it into it.
Yeah. When it's at this level, the losses that break you open we're mostly not equipped for. And one of the things that's interesting in the parallel between my work and my experience in some sense is that I've used a myth it's in my book and in my work for many years, and it's the Persephone Demeter myth. Do you know that myth?
Oh boy, we're going back in my elementary education. Is that the one where she goes down into the underworld?
Yeah, very good.
There's a pomegranate involved.
Exactly. So the myth, the very short bones of it is, and I'll tell you why I use it afterwards. But Kore, or Persephone, her name Kore is maiden in Greek, and she was initially called that, was very innocent and out there picking flowers. And she was grabbed by Hades of the underworld. The earth opens up and she's taken down into the underworld. And she resists the experience there. Completely won't eat anything, won't talk to anybody, won't embrace what's actually there. And eventually, all these various things happen. She's been split from her mother Demeter, who's left on the upper world. And eventually Zeus decides that because the earth is drying up, Demeter was the goddess of the grain, and we better liberate Persephone now because the humans aren't bringing us any offerings because there's no grain. And so he sends a messenger god down to get her. And when she's about to, now she knows she's going to leave, she eats the pomegranate seeds that Hades offers her on her way out. And so she eats these seeds. Well, when she returns, she discovers that, oh my goodness, now that you have done this, you must be 6 months of the year in the underworld and 6 months of the year in the upper world. You've just wedded yourself to the underworld. I use this myth because I think this is what we actually, as women today, need to learn, which is how to come back into the body and into the wisdom of the body. The eating of the pomegranate seeds, in a way, is a symbol of taking in the fruits of the unconscious, the fruits of our feelings, and honor those cycles when we need to be close and to ourselves. And I think we aren't prepared mostly for this, for being with the kinds of losses that are part of our world today, because we don't know how to do that. And in some ways it's interesting, or I don't know, archetypal, that I was teaching this for so many years and taking women down into Hades, in my depth programs. And then I got called myself to go to a whole level I never imagined I could survive, honestly.
Right. Like not realizing you were going to be taking this master's level education in real life world and
exactly.
then in your own personal life. When it comes to families who've experienced a suicide death, it seems like the two components of shame and stigma can really hinder that ability to be embodied in grief. And I'm curious how those two pieces, shame and stigma, were a part of your experience or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a psychologist, so I know I knew something about this, let's say clinically, but I was stunned by the depth of the shame swamp, I want to call it, that surrounds suicide. And both my husband, and in fact, I think many people who take themselves out of life have in some way also not been able to deal with their own shame. In the case of my husband, he had terrible tinnitus, this ringing in the ears, going really, really bad for several months, and not able to sleep at night. And if you know about tinnitus, it's a little bit like just having a constant screeching sound in your head that there is no cure for at the moment. But on top of that, what occurred when it ultimately all came down was that his business, which was separate from mine, he had his own business, was about to come tumbling down. I think his own shame, and I have some sense of this also because he did write a letter before he left, was in the mix here, right? His own shame of, I cannot stay and face what I've done. And then there is the toxic shame around all of those that are connected to one who does this. In my case, me and his family and good friends. And how could we not have known? And even the shame for me of, I'm at teacher working with women in leadership. I'm teaching women how to be more whole. And how could I have a husband who would take his life? And all of those things, I think from the very beginning, I knew I needed to tend to this and that I was not going to go in that swamp. Like, it really is like there's a sucking force that wants to take you in. And it had everything to do with my own ability to stay grounded in my own presence, and also to, in a way, because I could do that and I could look people in the eye, I wasn't hiding that it was a suicide. I was direct about what it was. It was my husband's choice, not mine. I think that it's a very difficult stage, especially initially, to make sure you don't tip into the swamp. And I had very good friends with me and community and family that really helped hold that circle. And one of the ways I did it, which I just add, is I work in my own programs and myself with ritual. And we set up very soon after he died on our property. We had a kind of temple building that my husband had actually brought over from Indonesia. And we set up an altar with, like a memorial space for him, so that people, because we were very well known on the island we lived on and in the city nearby, that people could come and leave an offering, leave a poem, just come and meditate, just come and be in their own grief around his loss, rather than hiding it all, is what I'm trying to say. We actually kind of opened the door.
Which can be so different than a lot of people's experience when they've had someone in their life die of suicide, and there's maybe an urge to contain that story or keep it secret or change it in some way.
One thing I will say that happened for me was just enormous respect for however anyone wants to go through something as horrific as this, that everyone does the best they can in the situation. And I could imagine for some people, they wouldn't want to do it the way I did it, but that's definitely what worked for me.
And so much of that seems to be influenced by how the people around them are responding as well. So if you have a supportive community who can talk openly about suicide without having a lot of negative judgments towards the family or towards the person who died, I can imagine that would be a more supportive environment for being open.
Absolutely. I mean, a blessing in that sense, I will say, to, in one way, I think this kind of traumatic loss, well, it's so shattering of so much of the ego. It's so messy.
It's like an earthquake to everything that you were.
Yeah, I actually call it an earthquake, a tsunami. And literally after the earthquake, the tsunami came in and it took everything in my life. I mean, everything that mattered to me really in the outer form was gone within 6 months, including my business, which I had at the time. I reduced that down to me. At every single level, it was like everything getting wiped off of the table and needing to start over again. But what was fascinating for me, it's fascinating now, at the time it was more a miracle, was that some deep core sense of myself and myself as part of a beautiful world remained, that I was going to be okay, that things were going to unfold. I couldn't see it yet, but a sense that I was not alone. And in fact, that's probably partly my spiritual belief, but also my community, the people that I'd been, I was a teacher of many women, and they all came around me and all of my family. And that's essential, because I think when you're shattered like that, you need the circles that hold you, that are whole, or even a best friend, or even one person if you're not in a situation where you've got larger support that can hold you and let you fall apart.
And to sort of maintain the outer boundary. I imagine people, whether it's one person or a community of people, coming together to hold that boundary so that the person who's grieving can disintegrate in a sense or come apart in some way, knowing that people are going to keep it from falling off the edge.
It's the boundary, but it's also I want to say, the resonant memory of wholeness. That's what I mean. I mean,
like a reflection back of
right.
That you are still a whole person, even though it feels like everything's been shattered.
That's right. That's right. And that there's a wholeness they're holding. You don't feel it in that time. You are literally falling apart, and you have to fall apart if you're going to fall together again. Let's say you're going to reemerge like the phoenix out of the ashes later. You have to have, there is the falling apart. To try to hold yourself together, I think is much, much harder.
It takes way too much energy to do that.
Yeah. But, sometimes you don't have a choice. So if you don't have that, again, that having a field of family and friends who can really hold that place for you for as long as it takes.
It sort of circles back to that idea that we started with around how time can be such a different concept when you're grieving. Like it can feel like 5 minutes, and it can feel like 5,000 years.
Absolutely. And often it feels like both. I mean, that's the thing. It's so freaky.
And you're like, I'm as exhausted as I would be after 5,000 years, but I'm as shocked as I would be after 5 minutes.
Exactly. Well said.
Suzanne, as we come to the end of our time together in this conversation, you've mentioned a couple of different ways that you sort of went into this process, connecting to your emotions, trying to be embodied with it. Are there one or two other suggestions you might have for listeners out there who are going through their own grief and maybe struggling with how to stay connected to themselves?
First of all, I think such a core place to start is self-compassion. It's something I teach in my work. I've taught for years, but I don't think I ever really knew what that was cellularly know what that was until I went through it. I did, because it's like the ability to be kind to ourselves and gentle with ourselves, with our humanity. I think that's a core and key thing, is the turn toward the self. And then the other thing, I suppose, when there's that saying, like, what doesn't break you makes you stronger, I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think it should rather be something like, it's what breaks you. If it breaks you, it makes you stronger. It was like, for me, I really broke open, not only, of course, my own heart, but in some ways into the world. Like I have so much more compassion for all beings now than I did. There's something so poignant about letting oneself, I think, be open, our hearts really be broken open. What I can say at this point, 5 years out, is I am standing, as I've said already, I am or let me say, I am creating my new world. It is still unfolding. But this wound is with me. It won't, in my experience, and we'll see as it continues, but I think it's almost like it's a tender place inside of me that will always be there probably. And that actually now is the source also of my creativity, is the source of the way I am in the world, the way I work in the world. And it's like the offerings that come from loss and the grief that go with them often come later. And I guess I'm just standing out here later saying, be tender with yourself as you're going through this, because there is the possibility that this dark night is preparing you for a way of being in the world that you've yet to imagine. And it won't be what it was, but it will be something.
I really appreciate that idea of being tender with yourself so that you are better able to carry the tenderness of the grief with you and to maybe turn to that tenderness as a source of inspiration or creativity or creating how you want to be in the world.
Right.
And speaking of standing here almost 5 years later and in your work and in the world, I will link to your website and to your book in our show notes, but are there other ways that people can reach out to connect with you or other things they should be on the lookout as work coming from you?
Well, my website is mysterialwoman.com and people can find me there. I have also a Facebook group, Mysterial Woman. Mysterial is Mysterial. And that's a place where we're in conversations about what does it mean for women today to be showing up in these ways that bring much more of our authenticity into our doing. So that's a really rich place for conversation. And on my website, you'll find links to the programs that I offer and the ways that I work with women. And the book itself is actually for any woman who is in a time of having their lives shaken up, having gone through enormous loss. This is a great guidebook, really, and I have a lot of practices in it. It's not the book where I'm writing about my own experience of loss. That's the one I'm working on now. But a lot of the practices are really applicable.
Great. Well, I look forward to myself exploring more of that. And I love that there's a Facebook group for the tenders to come together and share with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Suzanne, I appreciate you taking time today to talk with us and share maybe a more personal piece of your story than perhaps you're usually talking about.
No, thank you, John. It's actually quite refreshing to, you're right, this isn't my normal topic, and yet it's a topic that's very dear to my heart, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my experience with you and your listeners.
Well, thank you again, and thank you everyone out there for tuning in today. If you'd like to listen to any of our past Grief Out Loud episodes, you can find us on our website, dougy.org, or in Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or any other platform you might use. Thanks for listening. Hope you'll join us again next time.
Thanks for listening.